poetry and the narrative conventions of fiction to bring literature to life on the stage provided a blueprint for how to mine text for their performative possibilities. As the field morphed into performance studies and the objects of study expanded to include ethnographic text, the foundation, the attention to details, that oral interpretation provided never faded. In fact, there was a way in which the tools in my oral interpretation toolbox became sharper. Thus, my dissertation on my grandmother's oral history as a domestic worker required that I read not only her words as transcribed, but also her words as performed through her body. In other words, my training in oral interpretation sharpened my critical and analytical eye as an ethnographer witnessing oral history performance. The semiotics of embodied history were discernible through the critical eye of interpretation. When I began collecting the oral histories for my book, Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South and Oral History, a performance was the last thing on my mind. And every time I say that, people say, yeah, right. Because I am a performer and I am a faculty member in the Department of Performance Studies. Nonetheless, it was not on my mind. I was more interested in creating an archive of life stories heretofore undocumented. It was not until after a year into the research and after meeting so many great storytellers that I realized that a performance was in order. For the page could not capture the vocal cadences, verbal tics, nonverbal cues, and intimacy created through oral history performance. Initially, I considered adapting a script from the oral histories and casting a show of 8 to 12 actors. After more thought, however, I decided not to turn the performance into a full stage production with multiple cast members, and instead make the show a solo piece with me performing excerpts from various narratives. I also made this decision because I saw it as an opportunity to use performance to ask larger questions about how to stage ethnographic fieldwork. For instance, how does moving the narratives from the printed page and the private space of a reader to the stage with a public audience alter the narrative's meanings? What does the dramatization of the researcher's relationship to his or her subjects and to the audience reveal that the book version only implies? What are the ethics of performing these narratives in the absence of the narrators? How does the researcher sustain the focus on the men and their stories rather than the researcher and his talents as a performer? These are somewhat different questions I pursued when analyzing a poem or piece of fiction. The stakes were different because the narratives are those of living people, and as my deceased colleague Dwight Connergood so aptly notes, opening and interpreting lives is not the same as opening and closing books. And yet, the attention to details of a text that interpretation requires is a skill that is actually grounded in ethics, an ethics of care that propels one to pay attention to what the text is telling you. And it is the same sense of detail that propelled me to think about performing the narratives of Sweet Tea in such a way that their complexity was communicated and my role as a co-performative witness would be highlighted. From thinking through this process came Pouring Tea, Black Gay Men of the South Tell Their Tales, a traditional Reader's Theater rendering of the narratives, which I began touring to colleges and universities around the country in 2006, even before Sweet Tea, the book, was published. In Pouring Tea, I sit on the stage on a stool with a music stand with the script of the show and privilege the voice of the narrator. Voice not just in the aesthetic sense, but also in the political sense. Since many of the men have never had a platform to speak, it was important to me to focus the audience's attention on the story each man tells as a political act. Unlike a narrator in fiction, the stakes of these men telling their stories were high in the context of a conservative and sometimes hostile environment in the South. The conventions of readers' theater lend themselves well to a focus on narrative, but do not necessarily accommodate the self-reflexivity so common in performance ethnography. In other words, I felt compelled to implicate myself in the storytelling event so as not to obfuscate the role I played as researcher in the moment of oral history performance. My challenge in pouring tea then was to find a way to draw on the tried and true conventions of readers' theater, for example, adaptation, narrative theory, point of view, etc., while also highlighting the ethical and political standards of performance ethnography. I was also interested in the aesthetics of the performance. For an unrehearsed, badly performed, and poorly staged performance could be just as unethical and harmful in misrepresenting the men's life histories, and no one wants to sit through a bad performance. In her essay, Making New Directions in Performance Ethnography, Della Pollock outlines what she believes are 5 productive directions for performance ethnography research. They are international, immersive, incorporative, integrative, and interventionist. For the sake of my discussion here, I want to focus on just one of these directions, immersive, as it relates to how I employed oral interpretation / readers' theater with performance ethnography / oral history performance. Pollock describes immersive ethnography as an ethnography in which, quote, the self-subject of the researcher is immersed in the co-subject, entangled with, even ravished by the co-creative process, such that the subjectivity of the researcher is diffused within, even to the point of disappearing into the field's body. Accordingly, we no longer see the scholar I at work, but we certainly feel her passion, her grace, end quote. Pollock's notion here encouraged me to think more critically about my engagement with the men I interviewed in relation to the politics of representation in the site of performance. That is, when I made the conscious choice to move these narratives from the page to the stage, how the co-creative process might be foregrounded such that my subjectivity is diffused, and yet the audience might feel my passion and grace. The move I make to incorporate as best I can this immersive stance stems from my earlier point about focusing on voice. In the performance, I introduce each narrative with an audio clip from the original oral history interview that sometimes includes my asking questions. Preceding the clip is music that corresponds to the theme of the narrative I'm about to perform. So for instance, if I'm about to perform a narrative about coming out, I might play Diana Ross's I'm Coming Out. In this way, the audience gets to hear the men's voices in relation to mine. Following the audio clip, I provide biographical information about the narrator that I'm about to perform and where the interview took place. After a brief pause, I then begin to perform the narrative in the voice of the narrator, but without fully embodying him and while also referring to the text. To keep the audience from fully suspending disbelief, I do not excise the questions I asked in the original interview, and sometimes abruptly drop character to ask a question. The spatio-temporal elements of readers' theater in this context help facilitate drawing attention to the multiplicity of selves being performed. The narrator's voice, spoken from his own mouth on the audio clip in the past. The performer's voice as omniscient narrator in the present. The narrator's voice in the past as represented through the performer in the present. And the performer's voice in the past as represented in the present. Indeed, I found that expanding the bounds of oral interpretation / readers' theater provided a deeply engaging way to highlight ethical and political questions about oral history performance. Methodologically, it also provided a way for me to document ethnographic material that did not tilt too much in the direction of sanitizing the political states of the narratives or of undermining the complexity of the intersubjective experience shared between the researcher, the other, and the audience. So originally I was going to play a clip from Pouring Tea to demonstrate what I'm talking about, but because Amy found a beautiful stand, I'm actually going to do it live.
Oh. Thank you.
So,
sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home.
I had what I'll call a tryst or two with ministers. Two things happened that were significant with ministers. When I was 15, one CRB minister tried to get me to leave my mother and move to another city with him. My mother is mean, and she does a lot of stuff to me, but it's like she was a known entity. But I'm not about to leave my mom and have some man use me up and throw me out, and I wouldn't have anywhere to come back to.
that's Freddie. Freddie was born in Madison, Georgia in 1944. He now lives in Atlanta in a home full of antiques. The interview took place on August the 7th, 2005 at his home in Atlanta. Freddie, how would you describe your childhood? Oh, God, it was awful. I was an unwanted child, an unexpected child, and an unwanted child. Well, I'm the 5th child, but I think after 4 children, the doctors told my mother that she couldn't conceive any more children. Then I came along. So I was sort of surprised in that regard. But my father's mother was a very strong figure in my father's life. And have you seen the movie Roots? You know how they held the baby up? I kind of used that analogy. My grandmother held me up and declared that none of her blood was in me, which meant that her son was not, in fact, my father. And my father, being the weakling that he was, I think believed him. And one of the more painful memories I have is that of my father's cousin, AC. I do not know how that was spelled, but that's what they called him, cousin AC. And his wife's name was Major, and their last name was Talbot. Cousin Major said to my mother one day, now my mother's name was Annabelle, but everyone called her B. B, why don't you give Freddie to me since ain't Avy, whose name was Eva, but who they called Avy, and WS, my father. Now my father's name was Washington Smithson South, and he was simply known by his initials, WS. Anyway, she said, why don't you give Freddie to me since Aunt Avy and WS don't want him? With me standing there. And I remember crying and hugging my mother around the legs. And I must have been very young because my mother was only 5'2" tall and I came at just about her knee. So I was a very small child. And I remember crying and saying, Mama, are you going to give me away? And she said, no. And there were other things, but those are the more painful memories I have of early childhood in Madison, Georgia. So that's a little bit of Freddie. So that is the framing of the Reader's Theater version of the story. It's just me, music stand. As you heard, I played Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child because Freddie's story is about him being unwanted by his mother, and specifically his grandmother. As you also saw, I incorporated the question that I ask that prompts him to start telling his story. And I do slight little gestures, but it's mostly focusing on his voice, how he speaks. He's very southern from Madison, Georgia. So it's about focusing the audience's attention to the voice and the narrative. I continue to perform pouring tea around the country. But in 2009, Jane Sachs, who's the founder of Project and, a nonprofit arts organization, invited me to become an artistic fellow to develop pouring tea into a fully produced stage play, Sweet Tea, the play. While I was flattered by the invitation and was excited by the possibilities of developing the next incarnation of the work, I was also circumspect about how the transition from a stage reading to a fully produced theater production of the work would change or potentially alter the intellectual, ethical, and political intentions of the work. Nonetheless, I became an artistic fellow and worked with 5 artists, directors, actors, musicians to workshop the script and to prepare the show for full production. All of the artists agreed on 2 things. I should get up off that stool and do away with the music stand, and that the show should remain a solo piece. For them, the stool and music stand were too limiting, and my relationship with the men is what made the show different from other oral history theater productions. Regarding this latter point, they also believed that the script needed more of my own story about being Black, gay, and from the South. I, on the other hand, was reluctant about including my own story because I feared upstaging the lives of the men whose stories I set out to feature in the first place. One way that I rationalized the inclusion of more of my own story in the script was to think about it as a mode of self-reflexivity, which is now a hallmark of ethnographic research. Indeed, we have, for the most part, moved beyond the positivistic ethnographic models of modernity and contemporarily take for granted a self-reflexive mode of inquiry. And yet, self-reflexivity is not a panacea for the pitfalls of performance ethnography. In other words, when does reflexivity threaten the critical in the term critical performance ethnography? By colonizing the space of the other for which the research is supposed to account. In speaking on this subject, D. Soyini Madison writes, quote, "We understand that our subjectivity is an inherent part of research, but in critical ethnography, it is not my exclusive experience. That is, autobiography, travel writing, or memoir, or what some people call autoethnography. I contend that critical ethnography is always a meeting of multiple sides in an encounter with and among the others, one in which there is negotiation and dialogue towards substantial and viable meanings that make a difference in the other's world," end quote. Here, Madison makes a distinction between what she sees as critical ethnography and autoethnography by linking critical ethnographic practice with political and social advocacy for and a steady focus on the other. In my move from stage reading to full theatrical production and the inclusion of my story, I was challenged to conjoin critical ethnography and autoethnography in a way that adhered to Madison's call to make a difference in the other's world. This was not an easy task for me, literally, emotionally, or psychologically. And yet, the seeming insurmountable obstacle of overcoming this challenge was the very process that made it clear to me why I had to include my story. That is, sharing my life history in the same way that I had asked the men to share theirs made me vulnerable in a way that I had not experienced in the field. Indeed, I was challenged to stand firmly in the moral center that Dwight Conquergood calls dialogic performance and later co-performative witness. The process of writing myself into existence served not only as an act of validation and expression, but also as a self-reflexive mirror to use an image of myself, to see an image of myself that I did not or refused to see and did not necessarily want others to see. The I, and the I were in dialogic tension. Confronting personal demons that had lain dormant for years, I created the character EPJ to represent the me, the not me, and the not me, to riff on Richard Schechner and what became Sweet Tea the play. In the version of the play that debuted in April 2010 in Chicago and directed by Daniel Alexander Jones, who actually is a faculty member here at Fordham and just lives up the street and had me rehearsing here on your campus. My stories were included alongside the men's, clustered together in episodic groupings under themes like survival of the fittest and church sissies, my favorite. Jones's direction was steeped in the theatrical jazz aesthetic, a non-Western theatrical aesthetic that, according to Omi Oshun, Joni Jones, draws on presence, breath, listening, improvisation, simultaneous truths, collaboration, virtuosity, body-centeredness, and metamorphosis. In this iteration of the show, 93-year-old Countess Vivian, the oldest man I interviewed for Sweet Tea, although still alive at the time, functioned as an ancestor figure who I conjured through a walking stick whenever he appeared on stage. He accompanied EPJ throughout the show. Here's a clip from the Chicago premiere of Sweet Tea the play of me conjuring Countess Vivian. And I want you to note when you're watching this, the set, which is just gorgeous. How many of you know what a bottle tree is? 3 people, okay. So a bottle tree it's a part of folk art, Southern folk art. A bottle tree is a tree that people hang typically cobalt blue bottles on, but they could be any kind of bottles. And the lore is that they keep evil spirits from entering your house because the spirits get trapped in the bottles. So the set designer took inspiration from the bottle tree and created this huge, beautiful tree for the set. And then the light designer used the bottles as a part of the light design. So it's a gorgeous set with a portico and so on and so forth. So this is me conjuring Countess Vivian. Yeah, you may want to, I don't know.
How did you get your name, Countess Vivian? That nicknamed me Vivian way long ago when I was young. Some of them older sisters give me that name, Vivian. Then, down the line, somebody else put that other attachment to it, the Countess. Cause don't nobody call me that today, except folks who knew me way long ago. The younger folks that I know, they don't know nothing about my name being Vivian. Cause it really don't matter, cause people forget, and they don't know, and they don't ask, and you don't go tell it. I was born here in New Orleans on November the 12th, 1912. We lived in a great big old house, 2-story. At that time, we lived on what was called the 7th ward. And during Prohibition, they had a place where they mixed the wine. And it was really good. I don't know what they was making it, but it was really good. It'd be ice cold and just one sip of it make you kind of dizzy. It was really good. And they also had what they called, at that time, the speakeasy. And all you had to do was know somebody where the speakeasy was. And they give you a little card, and it'd be like a little club, and they let you in the place. Now in '83, I developed cancer of the colon, and I had an operation. I had radiation therapy for about 6 to 8 weeks. And I was told at that time, if I were to live for 5 years, I'd be doing all right. Well, I done lived. I done this since '83, so I guess I keep on going. That's right, honey. Don't let them set me in that chair, twirling my thumbs and set to worry about this and worry about that. You know, I just don't let things worry me. And I don't have too many eggs, you know. Just sometimes I feel a little stiff, and once I start moving is all about. It's all gone, you know. And the only medications I take is my aspirin, and I keep my Alka-Seltzer. And to keep my beauty up, I use my oil of Olay. That's right, child. That's right. I hope to tell you, because I know people who's way younger than me. You look worse than me. So I say I'm blessed. And I have a couple of teeth I want to put them in my mouth. But I don't want to wear them.
All right. So again, I should leave. No, leave it off. I can see. I'm actually gonna bring, leave that up there because you can't really see the tree here, but I just wanted to leave it on for a minute for you to see how elaborate that is because it's gonna be quite a contrast to the next one I'm gonna show you. You can turn it. So in a more recent version of the show, which premiered in Arlington, Virginia at Signature Theater in 2011, a new director and the artistic team at Signature encouraged me to include an even more in-depth self-portraiture. Again, I resisted that impulse, but later came to understand that it was less about my concern of upstaging the men and more about my own resistance to self-disclosure about unpleasant things about my life. Ironically, being forced to do some deep hanging out with myself helped me to write what became the theatrical conceit of the play, and that is, listening to these men's stories empowered me to tell my own. Thus, I framed the play with my own journey to selfhood, picking up pearls of wisdom and encouragement from the other men along the way. By the time the show opened in September 20th, 2011, it was no longer a conceit, but rather the truth, my truth. Embodying the character of myself each night is what helped me to come to a different understanding of myself. As Sydney Smith and Julia Watson argue about women's self-representation, my self-embodiment in Sweet Tea, quote, constitutes subjectivity in the interplay of memory, experience, identity, embodiment, and agency, end quote. This interplay of memory, experience, identity, embodiment, and agency are made manifest through performance, the site at which the practice of everyday life is framed and named as extraordinary in a moment of cultural reflexivity. It not only provides a way to establish one's authority as a subject, but it also situates the body in a kind of material surround that functions as a theater of embodied self-representation. In the context of Sweet Tea, the play, the material surround is actually the men's stories, the props on stage, and the viewing audience. It also becomes a part of the epistemological loop of self, a way of knowing the self as other and the self as same. In the third, and what I consider the penultimate version of the play, my story is even more central, but the set is sparse, providing for the men's and my story to fill the space in a way that fills a happy marriage between Pouring Tea, which I gave you a little excerpt of live, and Sweet Tea, the play, in terms of the first iteration. In this clip from the production, which debuted in Durham, North Carolina in 2014, I perform my opening narrative that then leads me on the journey to collect the stories of the other men. And again, I want you to know how bare the stage is.
My name is Yolandist Patrick Johnson.
What did I do? I can't see.
Born in Hickory, North Carolina. Population 35,000 on a good day. And known as the furniture capital of the world. Like many small southern towns, Hickory still has a set of railroad tracks that divides the north side of town and the south side of town. Whites to the north, blacks to the south. City is patterned after Washington, D.C., and divided into 4 directional quadrants: northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest. I grew up at 229 8th Avenue Drive, Southwest, in the Ridgeview community where most of the black folks live. And although Brown versus Board of Education became law in 1954, schools in Hickory weren't fully integrated until 1973, the year I entered first grade. I am the first African American born in Hickory to earn a PhD. So, on July 20th, 1996, my hometown celebrates Dr. E. Patrick Johnson Day. The ceremony is held in the old black high school gymnasium, Ridgeview High. Instead of a key to the city, I received a hickory stick. The two running themes on my day are, they said it couldn't be done, and from a zero to a hero. You know, while I never considered myself a zero, I understood that the black folks in Ridgeview were thumbing their noses at them, the white folks on the north side of the tracks who said it couldn't be done. But what the folk in Ridgeview don't know is that it wasn't just my being black. It was also my being gay that motivated my overachievement. It was a sense that if I could just direct attention away from some of the fundamental parts of who I was coming to know as me, by working extra hard to get that A in school, by joining every high school club and becoming senior class president, by working my soprano voice to outsing all the girls in the soprano section in the church choir, by agreeing to give lectures and speeches in the community to encourage the kids to stay in school and off drugs, by being the good son who sent money back home to help out. Then, and only then perhaps, when the news finally came that I am gay, it wouldn't be so damn disappointing. I stood before my hometown, as I stand before you now, and I told them the story that they wanted to hear, but not the story that I must tell, which is the truth. My truth. But in order to get there, I had to bear witness. And so I went on a journey back to the South for answers, and listen. To my brother's stories, father's stories, granddaddy's stories, son's stories, great-granddaddy's stories, so that I could tell my own. I need to walk the path to truth, paved by my clear ancestors, both living and dead. I need to hear tales and touch the stars, so that I can go home as who I am. Hush, hush, they are calling me to story. There is power, 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 power in the story. Hush, hush, they're calling me to story. beauty of truth and the beauty of story. I'm ready to meet. If you want the truth, you start the truth at the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the tea.
So in walks John Jackson, who has been who has seen every iteration of the show and who had been interested in doing a filmic version from the beginning. So about 3 years ago, John and I got serious about making the film and began to map out in broad terms what the film would look like. The film combines footage from the rehearsal process and productions of Sweet Tea, theatrical performance, with documentary moments from the lives of my interview participants and myself, depicting both my research process and the complexities of my relationships with the men in my study, as well as restagings of my performances of the men's narratives in their homes, where they work, or where they go to church. So it's kind of working on a lot of meta levels. One of our goals in making this film is to push the boundaries of what scholarship is and how it can be shared. We're grappling with questions like, how do we represent portions of other people's life stories? How do those stories impact us as researchers and viewers? More importantly, we're attempting to do something that transgresses conventions of established genres and that pushes at the boundaries between art, narrative, social science, inviting a reflection and open discussion on what's to be gained from doing so. Theoretically, it also returns us to Pollock's notion of immersive ethnography as a co-creative process, as the documentary film is a collaboration between not just John and myself, but also with the men I interviewed, as they enact some agency over how they are represented. The multiple layers of this film version have implications for anthropologists, oral historians, film scholars, performance ethnographers, and various other disciplines, as it pulls back the veil of the methodological processes of artistic and social science research. So I'm going to close my talk today with how I open, and that is you're in for a treat. In that, again, you're some of the first few people to see some of the raw footage from the documentary film. So I'm first going to show you 2 teasers that we're thinking about. The first one is very lighthearted, and the second one is not. And we can talk about which one you think is, well, we can talk about it.
And we're doing a compromise around the sugar?
Yeah, we'll do. Here are your tea bags.
A half a cup of the day was not doing the sound.
That's my mother.
I'll worship. Okay, you worship. Yeah, it sort of matches what I'm wearing. That's what I'm doing tonight, of course, right? best picture of sweet tea this side of the Mississippi.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Tea is the talk. What is going on people's minds? What's going on in your community? Tea is a story.
When I first came out, pouring somebody's tea. Okay, this is in the late 70s, mid to late 70s. Was something you didn't want to do, unless you were really being officious. Because the tea was the truth about somebody else's life. Maybe the truth about your own life. And you didn't want that poured all over. Sweet or unsweet.
So it's a drink, it's gossip, it's a place to have anonymous sex, and it's a party.
I mean, it certainly means the most basic things, what we had with Sunday dinner, but it means telling other folks, I poured a lot of tea here today, because I name names.
Giving the tea, sharing the tea, spilling the tea. So it depends, you know, what for comes before that. If you spill the tea, you're talking about somebody else, gossiping. That's a messy girl, okay? If you're sharing the tea, then that's usually you're talking about yourself, you know. You say, what's the tea, bitch? You know, what's going on with you? But if you're spilling the tea, you're gossiping, you're messy. Those are messy boots.
So that's teaser 1, and here is teaser 2. Time's up. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Baby. My name is Elondist Patrick Johnson. But since no one can pronounce my first name, I go by E. Patrick. I'm the baby of the family, the 7th child of Miss Sarah. I was born in Hickory, North Carolina. Population 35,000 on a good day. Like many small southern towns, Hickory still has a set of railroad tracks. Whites to the north, blacks to the south. I grew up at 229 8th Avenue Drive Southwest in the Ridgeview community, where most of the black folks live.
First African-American woman to earn a PhD. So, on July 20, 1996,
I was like, something's going with the ratios. Look at my changes. Maybe not.
Yeah, it looks like it.
'Cause it looks a little off. It's cutting.
Yeah, maybe if you take it out of full screen and then just shrink it a little bit. Oh, there you go.
Oh, is that it? Okay. Dr. E. Patrick Johnson. The ceremony is held in the old black high school gymnasium, Ridgeview High School, instead of a key to the city. They give me a hickory stick. The 2 running themes on my day are, they said it couldn't be done, and from a 0 to a hero. But what the folk in Ridgeview don't know is that it wasn't just my being black, but also my being gay that motivated my work. It was the sense that if I could just focus attention away from some of the fundamental parts of who I was coming to know as me, by working extra hard to get that A in school, Bye.
Joining every high school club and becoming senior class president, by working my soprano voice to outsing all the girls in the soprano section in the church choir, by agreeing to give lectures and speeches in the community to encourage the kids to stay in school and off drugs, by being the good son who sent money back home to help out. Then, and only then perhaps, when the news finally came that I am gay, to true, it wouldn't be so damn disappointing. I stood before my hometown, as I stand before you now. And I told them the story that they wanted to hear, but not the story that I must tell, which is the truth. And touch the stars, my truth, so that I can go home as who I am. Hush, hush, they're calling you to story. There's power, power in the story. Hush, hush, they're calling me to story, the beauty of truth and the beauty of story. I'm ready to meet. You want the truth? You start the truth at the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the T.
So those are the two teasers. Very different, I know. So because we go to
7:30.
Oh, okay.
Take your time.
All right.
We started a little late.
Okay. I just have a couple of more. Do y'all want to stop or you want to see more clips?
More.
Okay. All right. They're very short. So I'm gonna show you just two more actually. I'm gonna show you the opening. So we have 4 rough cuts of the entire film, and they're very different films. So we're trying to figure out what the story is going to be. But I'm going to show you 2 minutes of one rough cut of the entire film opening, and then the final clip is going to be one of the mini kind of the story of one of the men that I interviewed, and then we can open it up for discussion. So this is the first 2 minutes of one of the 4 versions that we have.
I think the South is a very unique place, like no other region. And it's because the customs are a particular way, like food, for instance, is really important in the South. And it cuts across class, across race. People commune and get together around food. It's really, really important. Passive aggression is, a staple trait of a lot of Southerners. Talking around a subject rather than talking directly at the subject, being explicit about everything. And so there are all these things about the South that someone who's never experienced that have to get used to. And even I have to get used to it when I go home. For instance, people talking to me when I'm checking out of the grocery store,
people adding a darling or a sugar or a honey to it. They don't know but that kind of familiarity that people have. And so when it comes to sexuality, then homosexuality is no more taboo than sexuality in general, in the sense that a lot of Southerners don't talk about sex in mixed company, or they don't talk about it in explicit ways. It's talked about in euphemistic ways. You know, people think that because someone doesn't say that I'm gay means that they're closeted. No, it just means that they don't have to announce their sexuality, because in the South, you don't have to. People say, oh, he's that way, or that's his friend. That's a really big euphemism for someone's boyfriend or girlfriend or partner or husband now. Is that your friend? In some ways, I think what they believe is a kinder, gentler way of rejecting you. Until they don't. So they won't say, oh, she's really ugly. Or they'll say, she's ugly, bless her heart, she can't help it. they won't, oh, he's a faggot. They won't say that. Oh, he's that way. Hopefully, we gotta love him because the Bible says, hate the sin, not the sinner. The South can be very unrelenting in its moral judgment about people's behavior. But then everybody's doing what they say that you should be doing, like drinking and smoking and being gay.
And so here is, and then here is Charles, his full story.
So this picture is of me and Charlotte on stage during the time when I used to perform. And my stage name was Chastity. In this picture, I was performing You Are My Friend at a nightclub in Charlotte. And I've now since then retired, of course, from my entertaining, but it's great to look back on this photograph. It brings back a lot of nostalgic feelings. My life has changed since then.
I was rich in my past life. Cleopatra rich, honey. I was a rich bitch. I still am in my mind, bitch. How he portrayed me, is it accurate? Do I act like that? Is that really how I act?
You get to decide which boa and which earring. Here's one choice. If I can get it unraveled.
Boa. Well, let's see. Now, when we are wearing these, who are we?
How are you?
She met Mama lying down in New Orleans, struggling herself over the street. She said, hello, hey, child, you wanna give it a go? For the longest time, I always knew that there was something different about me. I always knew that when I would disrobe, that I was quote unquote a male.
A sexual therapist diagnosed me as being a preoperative transsexual, saying that I had more female chromosomes in my anatomy than male, and that through surgery and medication, he could make my body match that what my mind was. But a part of that process was for you to live out the gender reassignment for a year, the minimum of a year. I did that for 5 years. For 5 years, I ate, slept, drank, breathed what it was like to be a female here in Hickory. And what has brought me to the decision not to have the surgery is that I felt that once the doctors had done the physical reassignment, meaning the physical reconstructing of my body, the one thing that they would not have been able to tamper with was my essence. Who I am as a person, you know. Yes, Charles would have been no more, but chastity has always been and always will be. I do believe chastity was here before Charles was. And the one thing that the surgery would not have been able to change was that very fact. And a future goal of mine is to one day land a job at Knox. And it would be a great honor to perform before Patty. And my favorite song of hers to perform is, "You Are My Friend." Thank you. You okay, sweetie? Thank you. It's the first time you've seen it. And the children go up, honey. When Patty comes on, yeah. Yeah. I just saw myself in the mirror. Beautiful. Thank you.
I just have 2 sentences to read. My journey from field to stage to film, from field to stage to film with Sweet Tea has been rife with ethical and political conundrums, personal consternation, intellectual provocation, and unadulterated pleasure. I consider myself fortunate to have had at my disposal training in performance studies, ethnographic field methods, oral history, and artistic training to conduct research on others that is transformative, not only for those whose lives are depicted, but also for myself as a scholar and as an artist. Thank you. So just a little bit more context about Charles. Charles is one of my interviewees in Sweet Tea in the book, and of course I've been performing his narrative. He, at the time of the interview, identified as transgender and lived his life, lived her life Monday through Saturday as Chastity, and lived his life as Charles / Chaz on Sunday to sing in the church choir. And when the book came out and when the play, I started touring the play, he wouldn't come. He wouldn't come to a reading, he would not come see the performance. All of the other men that I performed were flown to Chicago to be a part of the show, and they did a talk back. Actually, and that talk back is going to be in the film as well. So for a decade, Charles never saw me perform his story. And so when I approached him about being in the film, I thought the answer was going to be no. not only did he say yes, but he got one of his clients, he's a hairdresser, to come on a Sunday to be a model so he could be doing someone's hair while we filmed. And he also talked the club owner where he used to perform into letting us shoot at the club, and that was going to be the first time where he saw me performing that. So that's what you just witnessed. And it was an incredibly moving experience for all of us, of me watching him watch me, and yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot. So that's the context for what you just saw. And in his narrative on film, in the longer version of the film, he talks about why he made the decision not to see the performance of that I was doing of him, and it wasn't because he didn't approve, because I asked for permission from all of the people before I performed their stories, but he wasn't ready to confront himself. And I don't know if you noticed, he said I saw myself in the mirror. He wasn't ready to do that until then. And he also, this is really interesting to me, he narrates how when he was a child, he knew two things: that he was effeminate and that he was attracted to men. And neither of those things were approved of in his Pentecostal home. And so in his young mind, he thought the only way for it to be accepted was for him to be a woman. And so for 46 years, he thought, I am transgender. And it took him that long to figure out, no, I can be effeminate and attracted to men and not embody a transgender subject. So yeah, it's a whole lot going on in there, but this is why I do this work, the impact that it has on people's lives, and how, not just for the people I interviewed, but those who are watching, because you never know how you're going to touch someone through story. And those of you in the room who are doing oral history, you know that there's nothing like the power of the story. So we have a little bit of time for questions. I know I threw a lot at you, a lot of theoretical stuff, and then show you these clips. But anything, please, I'm open to your questions. Yes?
I love the way you include the narrators in the process, and I wonder if you've always done that.
Yes. Well, you mean for the perform?
Yeah, the performance, the whole thing, and not just the gathering, but everything.
Yeah, so I send, after I have the interview transcribed, send it back to them, which can get a little tricky, once people see something in print. They want to backtrack, and I did have a couple of folks do that. But I made it very clear that you can change, you can decide on whether you want to remain anonymous or whatever until it goes into production, then all bets are off. So I do that, and again, I don't perform anyone's narrative without their permission of me performing it. Everyone that I've performed, now that Charles has seen it, has seen the performance. And the film really is a collaborative process. I didn't show the clip, but Duncan, the gentleman who's saying that in his definition of tea said, you don't want your tea poured all over the place, sweet or unsweet. So there's a really funny moment when I'm performing him in front of him at his church, because he's a minister now, and he's giving me tips about how, no honey, you walk like this. You gotta dip it, dip it. So it really is a collaborative process with them actually directing me on how I should perform them. So it's a really interesting process going on there. Yes?
You mentioned in the other room, I guess for people that weren't there, that it's tough if you're part of that culture to be able to tell that story. So how do you think someone could tell this story if they're not black and if they're not gay, or if they're not a black gay man, in a sense? So I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I don't police people's ability to tell an other story. Because even though I belong to this community, I'm still not Duncan, I'm not Charles, I'm not Countess Vivian. They are themselves. I have a particular commonality with them, but I'm still different, I'm other. And so I don't believe in policing people's ability to do research on the other, but as I hope that my talk today suggested, I go into any project with a sense of ethics and a sense of self-reflexivity in terms of the power differential. And so I think, a white man could tell the story of black gay men. It would be different, but I don't necessarily think that the fact that he is a white gay man means that he can't tell that story. But it would be different, but that would be interesting to me to see, because they might reveal things that we didn't see because we're too close to it, if that makes sense. I'm currently, I already have done interviews with black Southern women who love women, and I don't use the word lesbian because they don't use that word. If I took the stance of, well, because I'm a man, I can't collect these narratives, I mean, that's a kind of cynical position that I don't think is ultimately productive. Will I get some blowback? Sure. All I can do is approach the work with a sense of kind of a moral center and a set of ethics when I'm approaching an other. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about the 4 versions of the film? Like,
So
what are the different ways you're thinking of telling the story?
Yeah, so we have 70-something hours of raw footage. And
Wow.
yeah, exactly, that we have to, and I've never done film before, and it's all in the editing. You can say whatever you want depending on how you edit it. It makes me appreciate fake news now. Anyway, so the version that you saw, the first 2 minutes of, in that version, I'm the through line. We start with me narrating, and all of those visuals are it's sort of on loop, the street that I grew up on. And so we start there, and then we keep coming back to me throughout, in between the stories of the other men. Another version begins with a dinner party that happens at Sean's house. Sean is the one who talks about messy boots. Those are messy boots. A dinner party at his house where Freddie, Duncan, Sean, and I are having dinner, and they're talking about their experience of being in the book and the play, and what that has meant for their lives, and then that segues into their stories. And my story is just one of those. Another version is me at the center again, but it begins with a radio interview that I did about Sweet Tea, and it's sort of giving exposition of how the project came about, and it too is more sort of episodic, each man's story with mind woven in between. And then the 4th version is, and I think it's the one that we're going to go with maybe. It starts with the rehearsal. So the conceit of that version is that I've gone back to the South to do these interviews over for the camera, but to rehearse for the play that I'm working on. So the conceit is that I haven't done the play, that I'm working on it. And I've gone back to them to get tips on how to perform them. And along the way, again, those interviews are more about reflection on what has happened in their lives over the last decade since the book. But again, the conceit is that I've gone back to prepare. So you never see me performing them. And then there's a big tease at the end. I'm about to walk out on stage. Yeah, back in Hickory, where I did a Facebook Live backstage where I was performing in my hometown for the first time. And so that Facebook Live clip is in there, and then I'm about to walk on stage where my mother is seeing the show for the first time. So, yeah. Yes?
What you just, this is a complimentary question to Amy, but what you just described, that version, that's completely the opposite from where you started.
Yes.
So, in all these iterations, is there one you prefer?
That's so hard to say because everything is a rough cut.
Not just in films, but in the evolution of the work.
Oh, wow. You mean the book, the play, oh, wow. This is gonna sound like a cop-out answer, but they all do different things for me. When I hold that tome, and it is a tome, it's 600 pages, I'm so proud to be holding that history in my hand. When I'm on stage performing them, I'm so proud to hold them in my body. People ask me if I'm schizophrenic because I just feel like they drop in and now with the film, it is so beautiful to have them be such an integral part of the process and to watch them now over a decade later tell their own story in a way. So they do different things for me. But ask me next year when the film is done, and then I might have a better answer for you. Yes.
Thank you for such a lovely, thorough presentation tonight. Two quick questions. One, how long did you know you interviewed before you sat down and interviewed them? I'm sure there were differences there. And also, going forward, are you also going to be performing?
The women?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for the men, when I met them, I was meeting them for the first time. I was never more than one person separated from them. Some I've known all my life, like I've known Charles all my life. So it ran the gamut from people I was just meeting for the first time to those who were, I've known either all my life or I've known them since college, or they're a friend of a friend. But even those that I've known all my life was very different. Again, going back to the power dynamics, sitting someone down and then asking them about their life in this sort of formal interview. And I learned things about them that I didn't know, surprising things, some things I didn't want to know. And then the answer to the second question, what was the second question?
About the women and
Oh, yeah, so I've been struggling with that. I've been performing the women in a lecture that I give sometimes. But in the context of a lecture, I haven't I'm lying to you. I'm absolutely lying to you. I just realized that. I have performed the women in a Reader's Theater context twice now in a mashup of Sweet Tea and Honey Pot. And I just did that in September at Tufts. So before then though, I was just giving little snippets of them in the context of a lecture. But I've been doing this mashup thing called Put a Little Honey in My Sweet Tea. And it's been interesting. People I just feel so self-conscious performing women. I don't know why, but I do. But people have been really supportive of it. And like the men, the women, I got their permission, and they actually, yes, one of them have seen me perform them. Yes, one of them has. Do you have a hand up back there? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
so,
then,
a question about sort of the different iterations of this project. And I'm wondering about like, all of the different people you've worked with and the sort of different other relationship, like working and editing and interpretive relationships that you've had across these different forms. So with both you had an editor
Yes.
with the performance pieces, there's a director involved, and then in terms of presenting the performances to the original narrators, and we were talking about the man who's the minister now, and he gave you sort of tips on the physicality of that performance, and then so with some of the clips you talked about, wanting to draw attention to a specific thing, so maybe like deciding to cut out things that you remember about the original narration in order to focus on the voice, right? So cutting out maybe some of the physicality. I guess I'm wondering about sort of all of that. What? That's not a specific question, but just sort of, I don't know, like story truth versus half truth kind of thing of like how you're negotiating all these elements, and then when directors coming in and sort of guiding you as an actor while you sort of have this memory of being the other in the original encounter.
no, that's a beautiful question, and it really came to a head in the second iteration of the play. Well, no, actually, I had a run-in with the first director too. It's different when a play is based on ethnographic material, and when you are the researcher performing it, because you were there, you know these subjects, you know that you're interlocutors. And so when you have a director come in asking you to do things that you know are not true to that person, there's a problem. So in the first version, the director was having me portray or represent one of the men as a snake. It didn't happen. But it was a moment. In the second version, the director had Charles, when he transforms into Chastity, wearing this 1920s flapper cap. I took a picture of me in that hat and texted it to the producer, and I was like, he is crazy, I'm not wearing this. I had to shift roles a lot from being the actor to the ethnographer to the playwright. So especially in the second iteration of the play, I would go home sometimes from rehearsal and rewrite something so that I didn't have to follow the direction of the director. And I could. And I did. So your question is spot on. But when you have that kind of material being adapted by someone who wasn't there, they can do whatever they want to do with it. A lot of documentary theater does that. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but for me, I knew that I could not allow certain representation of these men because it just wasn't true to who I knew them to be. At the same time, you do make aesthetic choices in order to make something beautiful or make something pop. To take some small gesture and illuminate it in a way that makes it shine in a way that you wouldn't. I'll give you a concrete example. So for instance, I talked a lot about, when I first started doing these interviews, I realized that the page couldn't reflect the dialects and the verbal tics. So one of the men that I performed, named Michael from Raleigh, has this verbal tic where he says whatever. At the end of every sentence, or whatever, or whatever. So when I perform him, it's kind of more exaggerated than what he does, you know, when he's speaking, because sometimes it's, and I was going to the store and whatever, you know, it's not as emphasized as I do it in performance. So that's sort of one example of sort of amplifying a little verbal tic to make it stand out and make that person stand out. But some of the stuff I just knew wasn't true, and so I didn't do it. There was a...
Yes, I do have a question. When approaching a subject matter that you personally identify with, you were speaking about how it's the other, and that you see that you believe that a white gay man could approach the subject matter and it would be different. Mm-hmm. So, like, do you have any kind of advice? Because I feel like approaching something when you identify with it very personally, it comes out, the work comes out differently rather than approaching it objectively and understanding the material rather than being able to like empathize with it. Because I'm sure there were a lot of questions that sometimes you kind of knew the answers to, or sentiments that you could relate to, and I feel like that brings out a different quality in the transcription of it than it would if someone didn't personally identify or go through those similar experiences.
Yes, it's a great question. I guess I don't believe in objectivity. I think objectivity is a falsehood. I don't think there's any such thing as objectivity. I think we're always implicated in the work that we do. We're implicated in different ways because of who we are, but I don't think we're ever truly objective. And I don't think there's any one truth. This is sort of going back to your question. I don't think there's any one truth. And I'm not really interested in the truth as much as I'm interested in how people articulate what they believe is true for them. That's what's interesting to me. The veracity of it, or the what's that word? Verisimilitude of it. I'm not so much interested, but what's interesting to me as humans is how we create narratives as a kind of truth, and how that functions for us. So the white gay man doing the stories of black gay men, sure, there's some things that, for instance, you know, the coming out trope is kind of a universal trope. But what that means for a black gay man in the South is very different from a white gay man. But what they have in common is the coming out. So yes, the white gay man can do it, but it's going to have a different register of it, and that's fine. What would be problematic is if the white man didn't acknowledge his difference, because that happens a lot too, where there's a kind of presumptuousness that, oh, you know, it's like saying all lives matter as opposed to Black Lives Matter. Yes, we know that, but Black Lives Matter. So it's not about discounting anybody's life, but it's the context matters. So, yeah, there was.
Maybe one more. Maybe that's a good place to. Go ahead, one more.
What are the rights in terms of if someone else wanted to perform these stories? What is the rights to the stories? I mean.
Well, I don't have, because I have a certain contract with the men and the press has a contract with me, so they get a cut. Like if I ever do it professionally, do the show professionally, the press gets a percentage of that. But in terms of anybody can, and I know for certain that these stories are being performed all the time in classrooms, for instance. So yeah, yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Again, if anyone's not on our mailing list and would like to be, I'll leave the sign-up sheet here. The next two events in the series are the following 2 Thursdays from now, and we're going to have members of the Militant Sound Art Research Collective Ultra Red coming to talk in part about a research project they're doing on the New York City ballroom scene. So I think it's going to be really neat, and I hope to see some of you back.